So we now begin to turn to our final panel today, which will be on political institutions. It's a great pleasure indeed for me to welcome Ulrich Preuss to Houston. Professor Preuss has long played an important role in German constitutional law, political theory, and at the same time in politics, although not always directly. Indeed, what's striking about his work is precisely the tension that arises between action and reflection. In this sense, he exemplifies the tradition, I think, of critical thinking in Germany, whether we connect that tradition to the Marxist Frankfurt School or to the older Kantian tradition. Professor Preuss was involved in discussions about students and democracy, indeed some of the founding texts of the student movement, one might say, already by the early mid-60s, authoring, co-authoring key works on the subject. At the same time, he was completing his law degree and writing his dissertation at the University of Gießen, which he defended in 1968. Soon thereafter, he became a lawyer in Berlin and Bremen, and professor of public law at the University of Bremen, a position he held from 1971 to 1996. He also became involved at that time in the journal Kritische Justiz, one of the most important additions to the intellectual landscape of legal studies in West Germany. For it was Kritische Justiz and the jurists associated with it, I think of Helmut Ritter, Joachim Perls, of course, Professor Preuss, who raised the key general questions of the New Left in law, about law and legitimacy, the limits of consensus, the relationship between constitutional legitimacy and the welfare state, the state's claim to require the obedience of citizens. In the background of this journal was always history, the history of National Socialism and the history of the failure of Weimar. Professor Preuss knew the radicals of the 1960s personally, including people like Horst Mahler, who since then has made rather dramatic and surprising turns to the Red Army faction and then to the far, far right. But Preuss was, as he himself once put it, always an, I quote, observing actor, what I would term reflectively or ironically distanced. As the most radical groups of the late 1960s broke into factions and then some of them moved into terrorism, he would defend a number of them. The decision to represent the RAF was controversial at the time. It was also utterly necessary. Criminals have the right to be defended and to be defended well. This is a position that isn't always taken well in any democratic society, as legal defense is taken to imply defense on other grounds. In later years, Professor Preuss would note in a revealing aside that these folks, he called them fanatical youth, were, quote, my favorite quotes from you, utterly incapable of irony or self-irony, end quote. In other words, incapable of critical reflection. I think there's a deeper sense to that statement. And while he was acting in the spotlight, he was also producing a complex work on the internalization of the subject. Now, to begin to explain the title alone would take me quite some time. It takes him so much time in the book. It actually is an important book. A friend of mine in Berlin has said it's one of the few German legal texts that is doing essentially something like critical legal studies, like our movement in the United States, in Germany. It raises questions about the very foundation of rights in the modern world. The problems he raised at that time led him to focus ever more on what democracy actually meant, how it related to constitutions, and not just from the legal standpoint, also from the standpoint of political philosophy. Do constitutions have a different meaning in the modern, decaying welfare state? Do constitutions function differently in an age of ever more complex and threatening technology? In 1989-1990, Professor Preuss served as legal advisor to the East German Roundtable, which we've already talked about at this conference several times. He co-authored the draft of the Constitution as a participant in the Roundtable, and in 1992-93, he advised the Thuringian Parliament on the conception of a new constitution. He was, in other words, directly involved with both the revolution of 1989 and the consolidation of German unification, which we're seeing at this conference. Actually, we're kind of pulling them apart as two related but not entirely identical moments. And exactly here, his position as observing actor becomes apparent again. The writing he has done on 1989-1990, both in his important articles on Germany, but also in a longer-term project he did on Eastern Europe, have been critical as well as sympathetic toward this odd, as he called it, I've said it before, revolution without revolutionaries. In recent years, Professor Preuss has broadened his scope yet again, turning to broad questions of sovereignty, human rights, and international law, matters of central importance given the German role in Kosovo and Afghanistan in particular. After serving as professor of political science at the Free University from 1996 to 2005, he has since 2005 been professor of law and politics at the Hertie School of Government in Berlin. His most recent book is entitled War, Criminality, Blasphemy, on the Transformation of Armed Violence. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ulrich Preuss.
Thank you very much for this extremely friendly welcome. I'm afraid that a speaker in Germany who had the same task which you had would have been much more skeptical and critical about my past, especially my past with respect to defending terrorists or alleged terrorists. So I'm very happy to see that there are also other views possible, and I feel very much flattered. Another what really strikes me, I'm sorry that I raise this issue, I never thought that my book, which you quoted, which you translated to English, the German title is Die Internalisierung des Subjekts. So this is a book I thought they would have just 3 readers in the whole world. Now I see one of them may be in Houston. I'm really happy, and again I'm really surprised to see that, and all the more I'm really happy to be here, and I'm grateful for the conveners of that conference, and especially to you, Carl, that you took the initiative to invite me here so that I have the possibility to share my ideas with you. Further, just a personal remark, and that's then I think the last one, at least in this context. It's a very rare event for a scholar to give a talk at a university about a subject in which he personally is somehow involved, and that's exactly the case, and that's what you mentioned. When I speak about unification, of course, that's an event which goes much beyond personal experience. But still, it is also a personal experience, and that means that I'm not always may not seem always very objective with respect to the interpretation of the event, although, of course, I try hard. Now, having said that, let me start with an observation, which, of course, is quite trivial, well, further remark. Of course, when I wrote this paper, and that was before I came to Houston, I had no chance to know what all the other speakers would say. And so you will find that there are many overlaps and with the elements and with topics which were raised by other speakers, including those of yesterday night, the excellencies, the former actors, but also the academics who spoke today. Although I hope it will not become boring for you, since each speaker, of course, has a particular view, a particular perspective on what he's talking about, and that I think may make things a little bit interesting for you to listen what I have to say to the political institutions and the consequences of the unification with respect to political institutions of German unification. Now, as I said, not surprisingly, the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989 marks a truly secular break in modern history. It was the first step in a series of events which entailed a profound redrawing of the global political map. Arguably, the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991 was the single most important consequence of the fall of the wall. And now that's something which already disputed. It ended the Cold War. Today we heard that there are different understandings of when the Cold War ended. So I have a third version, namely for me, the Cold War ended in 1991 because it was closely connected with the collapse of the Soviet and the termination of the Soviet Union. And this collapse of the Soviet Union ended the Cold War between the then 2 superpowers and their allies, which had dominated politics, economics, and cultural discourses of more than 4 decades after the end of World War II. With the end of the Soviet rule, the dissolution of the European empires ended in principle. The world of nation-states, based upon the principle of sovereign equality, as it had been designed by the Charter of the United Nations, was now completed, with the new states emerging from the dissolution of the Soviet Union and of Yugoslavia included. Thus, an originally European political construct, the Westphalian system, was finally established in the post-imperial area and legitimized by the United Nations. In this context, or this perspective, German unification seems to be the most natural, so to speak, event of pure and simple normalization of a situation of the division of a nation which had lasted more than 40 years and which had been felt by many as perverted and pathological. Obviously, this feeling had been widespread among the Germans, at least in 1949, when the two German states, namely the Federal Republic, the FRG, and the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, were established. Both constitutions, the Basic Law and the Federal Republic and the Constitution of the GDR, presupposed more or less explicitly the continued existence of the German nation as one political entity. Hence, German unification was always regarded and termed as reunification. However, in the decades after 1949, the sense of belonging to one political nation faded gradually away, especially among the younger generation. It was more and more supplanted by the perception of Germany as one cultural nation divided into two states. This was certainly the case in the Federal Republic, but I have the impression that that this observation holds also largely true, at least for the younger generation of the GDR. For instance, in the Monday demonstrations, which on its heyday on October 23, 1989, amassed several hundreds of thousands of protesters in the streets of Leipzig, and you heard Leipzig, Leipzig, Leipzig. It's not just the 9th. There are many, many other Mondays followed until the 9th of November. That this demonstration, which amassed thousands of protesters in the streets of Leipzig, the dominating slogan was "We are the people," demanding democracy from the ruling communist elites, rather than "We are one people," demanding national unification. The largest mass manifestation which took place in East Berlin on November 4th, which was also mentioned already, with more than 500,000 participants, and which by some has been regarded as the turning point in the overthrow of the old regime, called for the realization of two articles of the GDR constitution, namely the freedoms of speech and of assembly. They desired the same amount of freedom which the citizens of Western democracies enjoyed. Actually, they wanted to become a variety of a Western democracy. At the same time, national unification was not on the top of their agenda. Although it was not fully absent, that would be certainly not true, but it was not the main demand and the driving motive for these protesters. However this may be, in other respects, the project of German unification was by no means a political matter of course in the months after the fall of the wall. And we spoke about that yesterday night, the foreign ministers, and today as well. After all, formerly Germany consisted of two independent states, both of which had become members of the UN in September 1973, so a quarter of a century ago. Independent statehood and widespread international recognition as such constitute important institutional facts in the world of politics and of international law. Moreover, at the end of the 80s, the development of the European Economic Community began to spill over the field of politics, and the first signs of Europeanization tended to relativize the importance of national unification. Last but not least, the continuing common responsibility of the four allies of World War II, that's the topic of yesterday night, for Germany as a whole, reminded the Germans of the truism that their national unification was not a domestic matter of the Germans alone, but an international affair which was of utmost concern, in particular, of their European neighbors. As is generally known, German unification was only possible because the two German states unambiguously declared in the treaty on the final settlement with respect to Germany of September 12, 1990, the so-called 2+4 treaty, although Foreign Minister Dumas still, I think, preferred to say 4+2, but I think I prefer to say 2+4, that they stipulated that, and now I quote, "The United Germany has no territorial claims whatsoever against other states and shall not assert any in the future." End of quote. Now, this was clearly directed towards Poland, but also Czechoslovakia, still there at that time, Czechoslovakia, and maybe other neighboring or indirectly neighboring countries of Germany. True, in some other respects, German unification was only a further case of a general pattern, namely the pattern of transition from an authoritarian communist regime to a system of liberal democracy, co-market economy, which pertained to the East and Central European states formerly under Soviet domination. Thus, for 40 years, the GDR had been a member of the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, the Comecon. It had shared the fate of the Soviet satellite states of economic neglect and mismanagement, we spoke about that in the previous pattern, which had produced utterly underdeveloped and inefficient economies in these states. In this respect, the GDR is well comparable with the other post-Soviet countries. However, on balance, the GDR's transition from communism to liberal democracy remains a special and unique case because it entailed the vanishing of this state through the merger with another state, the Federal Republic of Germany. By the way, the opposite case has been the dissolution of Czechoslovakia into two separate independent states. So they took just the opposite way of Germany. So they separated into two, and the two states merged to one state. Now, obviously, the German case meant a clash of very different economic, political, legal, in part also cultural and mental patterns within one state. It is this particularity of transition which renders German unification a special case worth studying. Now, in what follows, I have selected three aspects of this complex process. It's impossible to cover all these issues which were raised by that very particular situation. So I chose three topics which seem to me interesting for discussion here in this conference. First, the institutional paradigm of unification. Has German unification been founded upon a new social contract between the people of the two states, or has it been based upon the shared sense of common belonging to the German nation? Obviously, this question pertains to the relationship between the nation and the constitution as two different modes of political integration. So was one or the other chosen as a means of integrating two different states into one nation? Secondly, I will discuss the tension, alleged or real, between the basic law's simultaneous commitment to supranational integration and to the objective of German reunification. That means the creation of the recreation, so to speak, the reconstitution of national unity. And thirdly and finally, I will deal with the thorny issue which was partly raised by Marianne Birtler in her wonderful keynote speech this morning, the issue of transitional justice as one of the most haunting problems of all post-communist states. But again, here we have always this special case of Germany among this variety of post-communist transitional states. Now I start with the institutional paradigm of unification. As we know, from a purely technical point of view, there was no need to create a new constitution for the United Germany because the political leaders of the post-communist GDR had decided to join the Federal Republic by accession and, as a consequence, to have the basic law extended over what had been the GDR. This option was offered by the then Article 23, which was mentioned here several times already, of the Basic Law, which defined the territorial scope of the Basic Law and stipulated that it, namely the Basic Law, had to be put into force, and now I quote, in other parts of Germany on their accession. End of quotation. Thus, for many problems which the other post-communist transition countries had to solve on their own and from scratch, ready-made patterns of solutions were provided by the proved and tested legal order of the Federal Republic. However, the availability of a successful constitution per se did not provide the answer to the question of how to adapt the basic parameters of the order of the GDR to the requirements of the Basic Law. Even more importantly, the desire for the majority of the populace of the GDR to accede to the Federal Republic was not a guarantee that their mental state was attuned to the implicit values and assumptions of the Basic Law and to the mental state of those, namely the West Germans, who had lived under the Basic Law for 40 years. Empirical research suggests that democratic constitutions tend to be the more stable, the more their authority pattern is congruent with the other authority patterns of the society of which they are a part. Of course, in free societies, one will never find a full congruence in the strict sense of identity of public and societal authority patterns. What is required, however, is a pattern of graduated resemblances which allows mutual responsiveness between the formal authority patterns of state and of civil society within one country. It was doubtful whether such a resemblance between the institutional solidifications and mental formations of the GDR, the people of the GDR, and the structural requirements of the Basic Law, in fact, could exist. For it could be expected that 40 years of communist rule, not to mention the impact of the preceding 12 years of Nazi rule, had left mental traces in terms of worldviews, expectations, habits, and attitudes which were discordant with essential premises of the Basic Law. After all, also the West Germans had needed 2 decades before they were able to fully internalize the innovative force of the Basic Law. So it needed the movement of 1968 for the West Germans to really accept and internalize the Basic Law. That's the hypothesis which I state. In one word, the implantation of a ready-made constitution into a society which lacks experience in its operation, corresponding institutions and responsive value orientations was probably a more difficult project than the challenge imposed on the other East and Central European states, which had to manage their transition of a non-democratic into a democratic society solely with the help of their own resources. Let me briefly explain the implications of the, at first glance, so easy GDR's path to transition through the merger with the other German state. The accession of the GDR to the Federal Republic was formally a unilateral act of the Volkskammer, so the parliament of the GDR. Neither the government nor the people of the Federal Republic were allowed to participate in this decision, much less to reject the accession. However, it was admissible and in fact necessary that the terms of the GDR's accession had to be specified in a mutual agreement of the 2 governments, which was codified in the much-mentioned Unification Treaty of the 31st of August of 1990, so 2 months before unification. Concerning the bargaining power of the 2 sides, this treaty was clearly asymmetrical, as the desire of the GDR, or let me say the people of the GDR, to unite with the Federal Republic was unconditional. The situation was paradoxical. Whereas the West Germans had no say in the decision of the East Germans that they wanted to form a common state with the West Germans, the East Germans had almost, I would say, or in fact no say in the determination of the conditions under which they would live together with the West Germans. After the implementation of their decision, their state would fade away, whilst the Federal Republic would continue to exist. So they had given up all their bargaining power, so to speak, by that decision. That was one of the problems. Once the Easterners declared their accession to the Federal Republic, the quasi-self-operating extension of the Basic Law over their country would be the immediate consequence. This constitutional construction did not look very much like the foundation of a new common polity by way of the fusion of 2 partners into a new polity, at least 2 equal partners into a new polity. Now, this constitutional construction of the unification is not a mere technicality of constitutional law. It is of great political significance. It implies the unification of 2 states, not necessarily the formation of one political nation. The former, namely the unification of 2 states, requires the smooth technical operation of the institutions of public authority. The latter, the formation of one political nation, envisions the fruition of a shared understanding of why people want to live together in a common polity. It was this latter path to unification which the framers of the Basic Law had in mind in 1949, when they stipulated in its final article, the famous Article 146, which was also invoked here several times, which stipulated that the basic law shall cease to be enforced on the day on which a constitution adopted by a free decision of the German people, so the whole German people, comes into force. Given the expectation of the framers that a united German nation, state would soon be re-established, that was in 1949, the transitory constitution of a transitory state, namely the Federal Republic, lost its raison d'être once the whole German people was able to reconstitute itself as one polity. Against their hopes, and the hopes of many others, and expectations, this condition materialized only 40 years later. But that made a big difference. Unsurprisingly, the conditions which the framers had envisioned when they devised Article 146 had fundamentally changed until 1989. That's, of course, no surprise. That's 40 years later. Now, more than one generation later, the constituent power of the German people, which Article 146 presupposed, as a matter of course, comprised individuals who had been brought up and socialized in two very different social orders. Hence, despite the unequivocal will of the great majority of the GDR Germans to unite with the Federal Republic, it was far from clear whether the peoples of the two German semi-states, so to speak, shared the same ideas about the character and the objectives of their forthcoming common polity. On this view, Article 146 could turn out as an ambiguous legacy of the founding men and women of the Basic Law. For Article 146 authorized the constituent power to put an end to the Basic Law and to replace it with a completely new constitution without being bound by any preceding procedural or substantive rules. After the East Germans had overthrown the communist regime and opted for unification with West Germany, obviously the situation had eventuated, which the framers of the Basic Law had envisioned in 1949, and which endowed the whole German people with its original constituent power to create a new polity. But as I observed, it surfaced with a delay of more than one generation, and this might have corroded the underlying premise of a persistent common understanding of how the united nation of the Germans would and should look like in its political setup. The stakes were very high, at least for the West Germans. After all, essential constitutional and extra-constitutional achievements of the West German state, particularly, of course, its integration into the inter- and supranational organizations of the West, could have been withdrawn by the constituent power of the whole German people. Now, given the desperate desire of the vast majority of East Germans to accept the West German model of society, including the Basic Law, of course, almost unconditionally, this potentiality, which I just painted, seemed to be a purely theoretical concern. Still, these concerns did exist in some Western German circles. The concern that the Basic Law could simply be abolished and be replaced by a document which was counter the visions, the ideas, the values of the West Germans. That was the question which I raised. As I said, these concerns did exist in some West German circles, and they played a role in the strategy to discard the path to unification predetermined by Article 146 and to opt for the alternative Article 23, which allowed, as I said, a mere unilateral accession of the GDR to the Basic Law. These concerns may not have been fully futile, for it could not be totally excluded that once the constituent power of the people was released, the process could assume a dynamic resulting in highly unpredictable outcomes. New alliances and societal coalitions between Federal Republic peoples, minority largely of course, and GDR people could produce new majorities with respect to some important constitutional issues and hence create constitutional facts which might diverge considerably from those embodied in the Basic Law. We can find examples when we look at the Constitution which was drafted by a subcommittee which was mentioned in the introduction, the friendly introduction of Karl about my participation in this experience. This draft of the Round Table, the draft Constitution of the Round Table, shortly before its dissolution, the dissolution of the Round Table in March 1990. As you know, the Round Table consisted of representatives of the old regime. So it was not just a mere assembly of the civil movement, but it was a kind of shared power device between representatives of the old regime and the civil movement, and in this respect can be regarded as the political representation of the GDR in the short period between the beginning of December 1989, so when the Round Table was established, and the formation of the first democratically elected government at the beginning of April 1990, as a consequence of the elections of March 18, 1990. Although the Volkskammer, the parliament which was elected on March 18, 1990, refused to discuss this draft constitution because the deputies feared that a new constitution for the GDR could become an instrument for the continuation of the GDR as an independent state, which nobody wanted at that time, or at least the large majority really was hostile to that idea. Its content, the content of this draft, may well give hints about what the GDR people might have considered as necessary elements of a common constitution once the constituting power should have been unfettered. For instance, the draft constitution of the Round Table contained a list of economic and social rights, such as the right to an appropriate lodging, to labor, and to education, a very tough public control over the natural resources of the country, and, to list just a further example, and a system of state financing of political parties which differed considerably from the system of the Federal Republic. So just 3 examples, and there are others which clearly show, well, the idea to join almost unconditionally Germany and to accept the basic law, and at the same time to have different ideas about about a new constitution. This somehow, although it seems to be inconsistent, still it existed, it coexisted at the same time. And nobody knows what could have happened if the constitutional power of the whole German people would have been released. Now, the details, of course, are no longer important, as obviously the political elites of the 2 German states dismissed the option of invoking the constituent power of the German people as a whole and chose instead this alternative offered by Article 23. The quasi-administrative solution promised a more even process of unification than the political path, by creating a new constitution, since it clearly enhanced its rapidness. Given the risk that the window of opportunity which had been opened in November 1989 could close at any time in view of the uncertain situation in the Soviet Union, and we discussed that extensively here, there were good reasons for this choice. So I don't criticize that. I just try to make clear what alternatives there were available and which choices were available at that time. On the other hand, it must not be forgotten that a revolutionary process triggered in Germany at another 9th of November, namely November 9, 1918, entailed the election of a constituent national assembly and the enactment of a new constitution no later than in the following August of 1919. In other words, this process of making a constitution after a revolutionary event, 9th of November, again, that's the reason why this 9th of November is a mythical event in Germany, because there's still another 9th of November, 2 others, namely the March of Hitler in Munich, the first public emergence, so to speak, of Hitler as a politician, and the 9th of November in 1938, the so-called Reichskristallnacht. You have heard about that, certainly. So the 9th of November is a very fateful day in German history. So, but I speak now about the more joyous, in my view at least, 9th of November, namely 9th of November 1918, which resulted in the Constitution of August, the Weimar Constitution, which, unfortunately, of course, also then had a bad fate, but still, at least this Constitution was materialized and was enacted in August 99. So, in other words, this process required less time than the seemingly smooth process of German unification 70 years later. However, it is idle to speculate how a similar method of reconstitution of the German nation might have looked like in 1989 and 1990. Still, it must not be ignored that a price had to be paid for the non-utilization of Article 146, and I will turn to that shortly. But before that, another remark. The choice, namely of Article 23 as the path to unification, and it was praised this morning by Professor Zelikov. I wonder whether he's still here. So he thought this was one of the great institutional achievements which helped accelerate the whole process. Well, he may be right, but as I said, this is also just a hypothetical assumption given other choices. But however that may be, the choice of this Article 23 as a path to unification had the implication that only few amendments of the Basic Law were considered necessary and in fact enacted as a consequence of the accession of the GDR. So this was exactly what 23 meant. So just extend the Basic Law over the new part of Germany, irrespective of social, economic, cultural, and other states of affairs, so to speak, in that country. Now, rather, the law of the GDR, of course, had to be adjusted to the normative requirement of the Basic Law. And that meant that a new Article 143 was inserted into the Basic Law, which established a time period of 27 months for the adjustment of the law of the former GDR to the requirements of the Basic Law. So 2 years and 3 months were given, so to speak, as a time period for the adjustment of the GDR law to the requirements of the Basic Law. One prominent issue which was widely discussed in Germany and still it was also mentioned in particular in the book of Peter Quint, which is a wonderful account of the whole process of unification, was the issue of abortion. The abortion law, the GDR abortion law permitted the free choice of the woman to perform an abortion in the first 3 months of pregnancy. Whereas the West German constitution prohibited this so-called Fristenlösung, so this option of free choice, as you see here in the United States. This interim period of these 27 months of two different abortion regimes in Germany lasted until June 1993, when the more restrictive regime determined by the rules of the Basic Law became binding in the whole country. So this is just one example for the painful consequences, at least many felt that as painful consequences, that now the Basic Law, which they had so desperately yearned for, was then really, I would say, imposed, although voluntarily, so it's a kind of voluntary self-imposition on the society of the GDR. Now, another implication, and now I come back to the price which has to be paid, of Article 23 is also worth mentioning, although it is less tangible. Since the Germans in the East and the West lacked the experience of a joint venture to discuss with each other, to listen to each other, to argue and to compromise with each other, and finally to establish a shared constitutional fundament for their future common polity, feelings of mutual misunderstanding, distrust, and cultural alienation have played a considerable role in the last 20 years of the united Germany. In some part of the population, both in the East and the West, these feelings persist and may even transfer into the next generation. Fortunately, not too many, because I have now students who were born in the former GDR, who are now in their beginning 20s, and they are, fortunately, I must say, they are not burdened by all these past experiences. But there are others where you really feel, well, there are the parents still very influential in forming and shaping their values and their ideas. Now, that is one of the consequences. The desire to rely upon the common national heritage in terms of our common language and culture, which prevailed on both sides. That was, of course, the underlying assumption of choosing Article 23. We said, well, everything's there already. So we have the common language, we have the common culture, we have the common history. So we are one nation anyway. So why doing this deviation, so to speak, through constitution making, that this idea, which prevailed on both sides, could not fully overcome the persistence of the different mental imprints which 40 years of division and of the experience of quite disparate social orders had created, and which might have been, I don't say would have been, might have been reduced in the common experience to generate a political union among them. Now I turn to the second issue which I announced, namely the issue of the Basic Law's simultaneous commitment to supranational integration and to the unification of the German nation, the reconstitution of the German nation state. As mentioned, the Basic Law was supposed to be the temporary constitution of an incomplete and transitory state. That is why it was called Basic Law rather than Constitution. Its lifespan was expected to be short, no more than a few years until unification came about with the eastern part of the country, then controlled by the Soviet Union and their German communist affiliates. This was the main reason why the founders refrained from two elements that they themselves actually thought necessary for a full-fledged constitution, and which therefore they put off for the definitive constitution of a reunited Germany. First, namely, they eschewed the design of a basic structure of the social and economic order as laid down in the Länder constitutions, which were created after 1945. And second, they made no effort to sanction the Basic Law by a plebiscite. After 40 years of West Germany's continual progress to becoming a major economic power, a viable democratic society, and a respected member of the international community of nations, almost everybody inside and outside West Germany was convinced that time had made permanent the once self-proclaimed temporary and transitory character of the state and the Basic Law. Though the official state goal of reunification was never abandoned, not least due to the jurisprudence of the Federal Constitutional Court, which insisted that the other state organs stuck to this constitutional objective, there emerged a more or less tacit understanding that the Federal Republic was a full-fledged state with a full-fledged constitution that did not deserve any longer to be regarded and treated as a transitional phenomenon. This development was corroborated by another constitutional commitment of the Basic Law, which seemed to point into a direction opposite to the objective of national unification. This was laid down in Article 24, paragraph 1 of the Basic Law, and stipulated that, and now I quote, the Federation may by legislation transfer sovereign powers to international organizations, end of quote. Note that according to traditional constitutional and state law, the transfer of sovereign powers of a state always requires an explicit authorization through constitutional amendment. That means, in German case, 2/3 majority. In the case of Article 24, no more than a mere statute was required, which could be enacted with simple parliamentarian majority. By lowering the constitutional hurdles of a transfer of sovereignty, the framers of the Basic Law intended to emphasize the seriousness of the Federal Republic's openness to the international community and its commitment to new forms of international cooperation. So, saying a farewell to the idea of an independent sovereign nation state. That was the idea, which clearly somehow was inconsistent with the simultaneous proclamation of the German unity as a pathetic objective of the Basic Law. In fact, Article 24 Basic Law became the constitutional fundament of West Germany's integration into the European communities in the 50s of the previous century. There was an obvious tension, as I said, between the goal of national unity and the goal of international integration, which became a key matter of political conflict in West German politics in the 1950s. During those years, Chancellor Adenauer pushed towards West Germany's integration, as you all know, in the West, including NATO, against the vigorous resistance of considerable part of the population, of the West German population, represented politically by the Social Democratic Party. The Social Democrats presumed that international integration would necessarily endanger or definitely frustrate national unification. even after the Social Democrats had finally come to accept West Germany's international integration to NATO, so the famous Godesberger turn, so to speak, integration to the NATO, EEC, and the other European supranational institutions, it was still widely held that national unification and international integration were ultimately incompatible under the given circumstances of the Cold War. Nobody could imagine that the Soviet Union would ever be prepared to permit unification without demanding in return that a united Germany abandon its integration into the different Western inter- and supranational organizations. It is not by accident that the West European allies of the Federal Republic were much less enthusiastic, to say the least. They were really concerned sometimes about German unification than most of the Germans themselves, because they too saw that tension, and they thought, well, there's an either-or decision, which sometimes have to be made, and so God save us for such a choice. And you know the famous sentence of the French, I think with Malraux, the French intellectual, who said, "I love Germany so much that I want to have two of them." So that is exactly the background of that conflict, or that tension, I would say. While it appeared that in the 50s the majority of West Germans were still ready to pay a price of this sort for their national unity, so to give up their integration because it was still rather loose and rather of a rather weak cultural embeddedness in the souls and the heart of the people, it became evident in the 70s that such a majority no longer existed. The generation born after World War II, in particular, could hardly imagine that there could be a potential tension which would force them to a painful choice in a moment of decision. In other words, among the three principal strategic options of West German politics, namely, first, national unification at the expense of international integration into the West. Second, international integration into the West at the expense of national reunification. And third, national unification and at the same time international integration or supranational integration. Only the second seemed realistic, namely international integration into the West at the expense of national unification. So just the reverse of what was a strong tendency in the 50s. Only the second seemed realistic and, given the circumstances, also desirable, at least for most West Germans, at least of the younger generation. The first alternative was disagreeable on several grounds. It could jeopardize the political and military stability of Europe and, moreover, if pursued, would probably provoke the resistance of the three Western allies. The third alternative seemed ideal for many, but hopelessly unavailable. And yet, in the end, it was just this alternative which nobody, in this annus mirabilis, as had been said, this miracle, so to speak, political miracle, although, as we learned yesterday, it's not just a miracle. It seems to be a miracle, but it was hard work and many strategic choices which had to be made. But I'll leave that aside because you know that after all the discussion which we had. Now, this event, so to speak, then materialized and finally resolved the tension between these two main goals of the West German constitution. And as you know, and this was also mentioned here in the last panel, in the previous panel, the European Currency Union, introduced by the Maastricht Treaty, was Germany's major pledge that it would stick to and develop its integration into the institutional framework of the West. After all, it entailed the end of the Deutschmark, in which many Germans took so much national pride. So they gave up the Deutschmark as a kind of guarantee for their reliability as partners in the Western system of integration. It is worth mentioning here that at the beginning of the 1990s, a reversal of the political front lines of the 50s surfaced in the Federal Republic. Although the majority of the Social Democrats and their candidate Oskar Lafontaine did not flatly oppose German unification in 1990, but they argued for slowing down the process, much like Margaret Thatcher, as we heard. Such caution was necessary because they unequivocally gave priority to West Germany's roots in and commitments to the West European inter- and supranational organizations. Given Chancellor Kohl's and the CDU's credibility in their fidelity to Germany's integration in the West and Kohl's simultaneous successful push towards unification, the Social Democrats' position asserting that these two claims were incompatible or that there was at least a serious tension between them appeared a bit outdated to many German voters. Consequently, the SPD lost the first all-German elections in December 1990 by a wide margin. Now, all this sounds very much like a happy end. However, the story is not yet over. Given the huge economic burdens which Germany and most prominently the West German economy had and still have to shoulder in order to establish, and now I quote from the Basic Law, one of the objectives of Basic Law, namely legal and economic unity, especially uniform living conditions in the united country, many Western governments, the EEC and the international economic community at large were concerned that Germany might shift both its economic resources and its political attention to the reconstruction of its eastern states, so the new Länder, as we say. They feared that Germany might become more unable and more reluctant to further. Okay? Well, I just skipped last part. That's a very easy solution. To further the process of economic and political integration of Western Europe. Chancellor Kohl did not fully realize this problem, or when he realized it, he minimized it. He contended that neither West German taxpayers nor the EEC would suffer from his drive to immediate German unification. This is the blooming landscapes about which we spoke. It may be the case that national unification could only be achieved because political leaders simply neglected its economic implications. And we spoke about that in the previous panel. Given the more than 12 billion Deutschmark, which had to be paid to the Soviet Union in order to buy the approval of the leaders, of its leaders, and given the more than 100 billions which had to be transferred in order to create approximately equal economic and social conditions in the old and the new Länder, it is not surprising to observe that the German economy has been under considerable stress in the last 20 years. Unsurprisingly, the red-green government, which came to power in 1998, was the first German post-war government, not the first one which waged a war outside the German frontiers, which was mentioned here already. There's another element which is interesting, was the first German post-war government which, albeit moderately, played the card of economic patriotism vis-à-vis the European Union. So they were the first to say, we too have national interests, and will no longer be able to be the paymaster, so to speak, of the European Union. That was the argument, which shocked, of course, many, including myself, I must say. And it's not by accident that the only German party represented in the Bundestag which rejects the Lisbon Treaty is Die Linke, basically the renamed GDR regime party SED, as you all know, with some West German elements included, which is deeply rooted in the new Länder. Ironically, the president is Oskar Lafontaine, as you all know, of course, who left the SPD shortly after the red-green government under Schröder took office and joined, and he joined and reshaped the Linke. So in other words, the tension between the national and the international commitment is still present even now in the German system, German party system. As I already announced, I skipped the third element, which is quite interesting, namely the issue of transitional justice, because time constraints are cogent here, and so I have to skip that. And let me just conclude with a few remarks. German unification has been a uniquely huge social experiment. In contrast to scientific experiments, its effects cannot be confined to a laboratory. The transition from an authoritarian political regime and its concomitant command economy to a liberal democracy and a market economy is as unprecedented as the short-term integration of two extremely different societies, one liberal capitalist, one authoritarian socialist, into one nation-state. There is no constitutional pattern for either of these processes, much less so for the management of both simultaneously. Of course, in a way, every historical situation is unprecedented, and it would be naive to expect any concrete conjuncture to fit into our traditional accumulated wisdom. However, modern societies have developed a method for coping actively with the unexpected emergence of new experience, namely the creation of constitutions. Constitutions symbolize the foundation of a new polity. They contain the founding generation's reflection of a new social and spiritual experience, experiences, and it is through constitutions that the distinctiveness of a historical situation is transmitted to succeeding generations. In this respect, the constitutional aspects of German unification are somewhat tedious in view of the exciting and inspiring historical singularity of the event which opened the window for Germany's unification in the first place. The procedure of unification was treated with utmost professional administrative expertise and competence embodied in a sophisticated treaty between two states. But nothing in that treaty betrays the joyfulness of millions of people who for the first time since almost 60 years could proudly say, "We, the people, establish a democratic polity." Thank you very much.
Professor Preuss, let me thank you again and once again reiterate, your paper is on the web page as well. So
not the last version. The most recent version is just here. But still.
But some of it, part 3, for those who want part 3.
Thank you.
It's on the web to get that very interesting version on the section on the transitional justice.
Yeah,
so.
Thank you very much. For that's it's really a consolation for me.
For us. And now we move to the second part of this panel on politics and political institutions and also on public opinion. We're going to move away from institutions with Professor Rohrschneider's paper and look more at what people think. But to begin with, we're going to start with an executive summary, again, of a paper that's available on the web in the full format by Professor Quint. And let me mention, for both Professor Rohrschneider and Quint, you can find the names of their relevant books in here. So we've already had advertisements for some very good books here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This paper is called German Unification and the Constitutional Court, and picks up some of the constitutional themes that Professor Preuss mentioned. The framers of the West German Basic Law of 1949 were unwilling to accept the division of Germany as a permanent fait accompli. Accordingly, the Basic Law contained two separate methods of achieving unification, Articles 23 and 146, and the goal of unification was proclaimed in the preamble. Moreover, from a very early point, the German Constitutional Court clearly recognized that ultimate unification was one of the principal pillars of the Basic Law. Accordingly, when in 1990 East and West Germany were united under Article 23, this achievement could clearly be seen as the fulfillment of one of the most important requirements of the Constitution. This fundamental fact set the tone for the decisions of the Constitutional Court arising out of German unification. Because unification was a primary constitutional goal, it was clear that the Court could not interfere in any serious way with the political movement toward unification. On the other hand, by 1990, the Constitutional Court had become one of the most powerful and highly respected of all governmental institutions in Germany, and it was therefore not to be expected that the Court would simply defer without examination or analysis to every choice that had been made by the government. Moreover, the detailed settlement upon unification had conferred advantages and disadvantages on various groups and individuals. And there was certainly the possibility of undue oppression in some cases. The result of these contending factors was a carefully calibrated set of cases in the Constitutional Court relating to German unification, which, broadly speaking, shared the following three characteristics. First, the major political decisions relating to German unification were uniformly upheld by the Constitutional Court. There was no serious judicial interference with the process. Second, yet in a significant number of cases, the Constitutional Court required rather nuanced adjustments of the rules for unification in a manner that granted a certain measure of protection to the losers in the unification process, whether in any given case the losers happen to be economically weak citizens of the former East Germany or more prosperous former landowners living in the West. Third, overall, therefore, the Constitutional Court frequently acted as a type of mediator, accepting the basic principles of unification, but seeking to assure that the losers were not unduly disadvantaged. In these cases, the court also seemed to be serving notice that even in the most sensitive areas of adjudication, the court was still present and therefore always must be taken into account by the political branches. Let me briefly illustrate these points by reviewing certain notable cases of the period. The first important case considered whether the 5% cutoff rule common in West German elections could be constitutionally employed in the first all-German election in December 1990. This rule requires that for a political party to be represented in the Bundestag, it must ordinarily receive at least 5% of the total popular vote, so that there won't be a proliferation of small splinter parties that could foster parliamentary instability, as occurred during the Weimar Republic. Although the court had upheld the 5% rule in the past, it found that the rule could not be used constitutionally in this election, because requiring the new parties of East Germany to obtain 5% of the total all-German popular vote would subject these parties to an almost impossible burden in light of the fact that most of them had just been in existence for less than a year. Yet the court obviously did not want to stand in the way of this crucial election, and so its opinion carefully explained how the election could be conducted in a constitutional manner by imposing separate 5% rules in the East and the West. Thus, the court did not interfere with the election overall, but it made adjustments in a manner that gave the small East German parties an equalizing advantage for one election cycle only, so that they might have a better chance of establishing themselves in the total electoral landscape of unified Germany. In the second of our cases, the court considered the fate of the civil service in the East. As a result of the constitutional and political imperative of full employment in East Germany, the civil service of the GDR was considerably larger than necessary. Accordingly, unification required the abolition of a very large proportion of these positions, representing hundreds of thousands of employees. In one of its most important decisions on German unification, the Constitutional Court upheld the abolition of these civil service jobs. The court acknowledged that the dismissals must be tested against Article 12 of the Basic Law, which provides a right of individuals to choose and retain their employment. But here the court found this right was outweighed by the subordinating interest of the German state in creating a viable governmental and economic system after unification. And yet, in accordance with the pattern outlined above, the Constitutional Court was not willing to grant the government carte blanche. The court suggested that certain measures of assistance provided to those who had lost their jobs were constitutionally required, and it went on to mandate further assistance for particularly disadvantaged persons whose jobs were imperiled, as well as assistance for mothers and pregnant women pursuant to a special provision of the Basic Law. In this way, the court did not impair the central actions of the government in this essential aspect of unification, but it did intervene to grant certain compensating advantages to some of the losers in the process. Let us now turn to the third of our cases. The government of the Soviet occupation zone, as well as the subsequent government of the GDR, were perceived in the West as injustice regimes, governments which deprived their citizens of human rights on a broad scale. One of the principal goals of the federal government upon German unification, therefore, was to provide some redress for widespread violations of human rights. In one of the most important of these measures, the government sought to provide some redress for people whose property in Eastern Germany had been confiscated in violation of Western concepts of property rights. Thus, in accordance with this program, Eastern citizens whose houses had been seized by the GDR government when they fled to the West were generally entitled to recover this property. In contrast, however, persons whose property had been confiscated under the Soviet occupation regime from 1945 to 1949 were totally excluded from the program of restitution. The possibility of compensation for these expropriations was left to the discretion of Parliament. Why was the property seized by the Soviet occupation regime treated differently from the property confiscated by the GDR state? The Soviet confiscations comprised the major industrial plants in the east, as well as farms of more than 250 acres, 100 hectares, which included, among other holdings, the vast aristocratic estates of the so-called East Elbian Junkers. The government maintained that the Soviet Union, which possessed a legal veto over unification, had insisted that this property be excluded from restitution, although whether the Soviet Union had actually made such a demand was subject to debate, even among former high Soviet officials of the period. West German negotiators may also have feared that the return of this property could jeopardize, East German negotiators may also have feared that the return of this property could jeopardize certain ownership claims of GDR citizens arising from the Boden reform of the Soviet era. But at bottom, the decision to exclude the Soviet expropriations from restitution most likely stemmed from the view that it would be unthinkable to recreate even a shadow of the quasi-feudal economic and social structures of rural Eastern Germany in the 19th and 20th centuries, early 20th centuries, which many thought provided important support for the rise of the Nazis. A deeper look into the historical circumstances, moreover, may suggest significant moral differences between the claims of the two groups. The individual houses of persons fleeing to the West, which constituted much of the property seized by the GDR regime, had probably been acquired by the individual owners through ordinary purchase in accordance with the general requirements of the rule of law. This type of property seized by the GDR was generally subject to restitution. In contrast, the huge quasi-feudal estates of the Eastern German aristocrats, originally acquired in past centuries, may well not have been acquired or maintained in a manner that satisfies present concepts of the rule of law. Moreover, the large industrial plants were, most likely in every case, deeply involved in the Nazi war machine. These forms of property expropriated by the Soviet occupation government were not subject to restitution. The exclusion of the Soviet expropriations from restitution was challenged in the Constitutional Court, but the property settlement was certainly one of the most fundamental decisions of German unification, and the court was obviously unwilling to interfere with it in any significant way. Thus, the court upheld the treatment of the Soviet expropriations. Yet, following the general pattern suggested above, the court made one significant adjustment in favor of the former owners of property seized during the Soviet occupation. The court concluded that the regime of compensation, which had been left to the discretion of Parliament in the Unification Treaty, must constitutionally be made mandatory. On the other hand, the court also indicated that the Parliament would have substantial discretion in determining the level of compensation, and ultimately this level was set at a rather low amount. Thus, the court required that the losers in this aspect of unification, the former large landowners or their heirs, be given more than they received under the Unification Treaty. But this redress was not enough gravely to impair the government's ability to put into effect the core decisions of unification. As time presses, I'll touch only very briefly on two additional cases. First, the GDR had a more liberal rule on abortion, as we've heard, than the Federal Republic, because this liberalized rule had become the basis of a social institution in the GDR. The Eastern negotiators were reluctant to give way on this point. After a number of complex developments taking us up in 1994 and 95, therefore, the GDR's rule on abortion, or something very much like it, ultimately made its way into the law of the Federal Republic. Thus, here again, the court, as well as the all-German legislature, conceded something to the overall losers in the unification process. Finally, in another interesting set of cases, the Constitutional Court upheld the convictions of East German border guards who would use deadly force at the Berlin Wall against persons seeking to escape from the GDR. In these cases, the courts seemed to disregard the constitutional prohibition of retroactive punishment by invoking natural law concepts and reinterpreting East German law in a manner that never would have been employed by the East German courts of the old regime. But even here, the courts seem to have built in an implicit adjustment into the results, because in almost all cases, the border guards received suspended sentences and so were not penalized in a very concrete manner. A number of the higher officials, in contrast, did receive rather modest jail terms. Overall, however, these convictions did not really seem to serve any of the traditional goals of the criminal law. Rather, the principal result of these cases seems to have been a theoretical and rhetorical result, i.e., placing the stamp of criminality and illegitimacy on the actions of the prior GDR regime, and thus retrospectively calling into question the legitimacy of the GDR state itself. In conclusion, the Constitutional Court of the Federal Republic of Germany has had numerous dramatic and important moments in its almost 60 years history. Many of these instances were important because the court invalidated statutes of parliament or judgments of the ordinary civil or criminal courts. But the decisions on German unification were important in a somewhat different manner. Instead of permanently striking down significant legislation, the court upheld the basic political decisions on unification. Yet at the same time, the court also sought a degree of social integration through attempts to mitigate the burdens imposed upon some of the inevitable losers in the unification process.
Thank you, Professor Quint. We're now going to switch gears slightly. We've heard about the constitutional aspects of unification. This conference comes not only slightly before the 20th anniversary of November 9th, but also slightly after the sixth post-unification election. Is that right, Robert? You don't have to count in your head, but that's...
Well, I'm just seeing can't open the PowerPoint presentation, so I'm slightly distracted. Yes, I think that's right. 6 is about right.
So we're switching gears to talk about public opinion now. And Professor Rohrschneider has just been the co-director of the German election studies, or you too much credit. You worked on it. You have the data. He's one of the first to have the data. And so he's going to show us, as soon as the PowerPoint's up, he's going to show us the latest findings. I think some of it came in just this week, you said.
That's true, which is one of the reasons why there's no paper yet, because I got the last data sets on Monday and was frantically preparing them for the talk here. Now, this doesn't look too good over here, so I'm hoping that some of you at least brought the handouts. I'm at least going to start talking about my talk. And in some ways, 2009 seems to be very far away from what everybody else has been talking about, namely 1989. But if you look at the very first figure, which is simply the election results from 2009, it's the very front page, you get the distribution of parties for all of Germany, and you know the election outcome. And if you then were to take the time and disaggregate it by East and West, you would see the obvious, namely the Linken Party is very strong in the East, has a 25% roughly, whereas in the West it barely, like that didn't even get 5%, got very close. And just by pointing to this one regional variation in party success, the past has caught up with the present. And so what we do is, in terms of understanding elections, we cannot ignore the past 20 years. In fact, we can't ignore even the past 30 years. So I was going to pull up the slide here, which is the slide called Understanding the Electorate, which is a sort of conceptual map for how we approach the analyses of elections. Now, I see something over here, that's why I'm hesitating, but rather. So the conceptual map essentially takes a three-layered approach to studying the election outcome of 2009. The first one is to pick up on a theme that Ulrich Preuss and Marianne Birtler actually alluded to, and that is that the division of Germany for over 40 years created two different mindsets. And we call it political science, we call it two different political cultures, which essentially refers to the fact that people were exposed to different regimes, different types of institutions, different value systems, and therefore the presumption is that this different regime experience has produced a legacy in the minds of people. There we go. So that's the first basic question. And so the first basic question, that is, are there two political cultures? Does the fact, is presuming that there are two different political cultures, time starts, well, a minute ago, okay? I realize I'm the last between you and dinner. So won't take too long. So the first basic question leads to the second one. Are there two different electorates or two different party systems? And there are a number of studies, including myself, who have been preoccupied with that question. And there is some evidence that at least during the early 1990s, that the electorate in East Germany and West Germany behaved quite differently. For example, just to give you one example of many I could give you, is that the working class in East Germany in the first election in 1990 disproportionately voted for the Union, whereas in the West, the working class voted for the SPD. So that's just one example, illustrating the basic question, are there two different electorates? And do there continue to be two electorates 20 years after Germany's unification? And then there's obviously the last more very specific context of 2009, where we asked what degree do 1 and 2, along with this very specific, the context of 2009, in what ways do they shape the electoral outcome? Now let me just walk you through a couple of pieces of evidence about number 1, and then quickly move on to number 3. There are numerous pieces of evidence which I could show you here, which ask questions about public opinion, measuring the degree to which there are two different political cultures. And I just picked out 3 in part because of their ability, but also in part because they essentially tell the story that all the other indicators, literally hundreds, I've looked at and other people have looked at. And that is, the first one is socialism as an idea. People in East and West Germany were asked the question, okay, all the pictures disappear. Okay, so you look at no text, handouts again. So if you look at socialism as an idea that is poorly implemented, and you see a time series here from covering 1990 through 2009. In fact, the 2009 time point has just been asked, and Einstein hasn't even released it yet, but let me use it for this presentation here. That's the Monday figure, the latest. And what it does show is a persistent difference of agreement between East and West Germany. The top line is percentage agreement in the East, and the bottom line is the percent agreement in the West. Now you find some variation, you find some drop in at the very latest time point. I don't have an explanation for that. On the whole, though, there are two flat lines if you were to draw the trend line here. Now the second one is on the bottom of the page, is a sort of harder question by all public opinion standards. Here people have to evaluate the trade-off. They have to choose between freedom and equality. The question wording is actually very nicely constructed. It points out that both are important, that some people sometimes choose, and what is it if push comes to shove, what would you choose? And so you see that in the West, which is the top figure, initially it starts out to be a wide difference between people who choose freedom, the vast majority, as opposed to equality. But then it slowly narrows, and freedom still has the edge at the end, but not by as much as it used to. And at the bottom, you clearly see that equality carries the day, whereas freedom plays second fiddle. Now, there's some indication then that the legacy in the minds of people in terms of the basic value orientation continues to exist in the minds of people. The most important question is, getting back to the two constitutional papers, does this matter for how publics in Germany, how citizens in Germany evaluate the existing regime? We, in the end, want to know to what degree is the constitution, our constitutional principles and the existing constitution firmly anchored in the minds of East and West German voters. And that's really the worrisome part. particularly in light of the fact that it doesn't change all that much. The top part, and that's the good news, is the West German trend series, where you clearly see that the existing constitution continues to be supported by a fairly large number, by a substantial majority. And that does not nope. Forget it. It's just only wherever you are, don't even try it. So, but the bottom figure is the one which is the worrisome one. It essentially tells the story that 2/3 of East Germans either reject the existing system or are ambivalent about it. That is the don't knows. There's only 1/3 of the East German population which says the existing constitution is the best one, and I don't want another one. So that's the backdrop against which the election in 2009 took place. Now, here's how far we have gotten so far with our analysis of the 2009 election. The first question is, to what degree do the basic value difference across East and West affect the vote choice? Something that already emerged in the context of some of the comments. To what degree does the Linke Partei mobilize systems dissatisfaction with the current system is one of the questions we want to address. We couldn't do it with the current data set yet. What we could do is look at a couple of the most obvious questions. The first one is, mine doesn't work. On A, the first one is, did the enormous economic crisis have an effect on the vote choice? And the answer is basically no. And it has something to do with the fact that issues only become important for voters if they can choose. Issues have to be important, and people have to have a choice. Now, A, the issue was important, but people didn't really have a choice, at least not within the major parties, because it was a grand coalition. So here we see a nice textbook example of how what elites do or offer in terms of the menu option actually affects or prevents voters from making use of a highly salient issue in their vote choice. The second piece of evidence you would see in the handout is that life wasn't really very fair for the SPD. There is a huge difference in terms of how much credit the Union got for strong government performance as opposed to the Social Democrats. So in other words, the SPD could be evaluated positively, but taking into account a large number of other considerations, it didn't really translate into much of a vote gain. It was a lose-lose situation for the SPD. And the last one is, we call it the cat that did bark. There's a backdrop here in terms of the debate in the literature. Much of the literature says that candidates don't really matter in Germany's party system. Now, there's one exception, the Schröder effect in 2002, his big row with Bush won him the election. But everybody said, or most people said, that's an exception. But what we find is with the two fairly, well, let's put it this way, not overly strong or popular candidates, strong candidates, the Merkel effect is incredibly strong. We see it. I've rarely seen such a strong effect of a single factor on the vote choice in the past 20 years. So those are the three things we could analyze up to this point, and you see lots of evidence in support of historians' claims. Okay, that's where it gets stuck on the really interesting part. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I spent so much time doing all of this. Okay, this is just a nice one. You have to suffer through this with me. It just shows you, just gives an illustration how we as electoral politics researchers sort out the effect of a variable. So this is all based on some multivariate analysis, which essentially lets me sort out how strong, what's the net effect, the independent effect of the factor on the vote choice for the two big parties. And what you see here is the enormous increase, I should say on the x-axis, is the government performance with a party plotted. On the y-axis is the probability of voting for a party. And what you see here is that particularly for floating voters, the independent voter, there's a huge increase if voters believe that the CDU performed well. Whereas the SPD got a slight increase, but the percentage differences are considerable, roughly 30% at the very positive end. And you can sort this out mathematically, and I do that in the handout, or illustrating the aggregate effect of these kind of trends. It's huge. The same is true for the Merkel effect, particularly in the East. Angela Merkel is much more popular both in the West and the East compared to Steinmeier, and it does have another huge boost to the vote of the Union. Now, what does all of this mean for the executive summary? And it means that we do find persistent East-West differences over values. That connects back to point number one. Number two you saw, number three you saw too. So overall, we find quite a few East-West similarities in terms of the determinants of the vote choice. So in that sense, East and West have become more similar over time. That's our tentative conclusion up to this point. I will leave out 5 and 6 because I obviously don't have the time to prepare the state-of-the-art report here for you to make sense of all of that. And here are some obvious questions which we still have to address. We have to look at to what degree the Linke Partei benefits from a protest vote. That's one big question. And there's some evidence it's there. The one piece of news I can tell you is the Linke Partei doesn't simply benefit from perceptions that the economy is doing poorly. It's not that simple. There's something else going on, presumably something of the sort that the Linke Partei is attracting a number of people who still adhere to socialist values. Actually, I've done analysis for 2005, in particular 2002, where that is actually very much the case. And number two, that the Linke Partei also attracts people who are dissatisfied with the current political system. So the last point I want to make is there are some other questions we have to address, in particular why people didn't vote in the first place. You may have heard about the fairly large number of abstentions, of non-voters, and it has probably something to do with the nature of the Grand Coalition and also with the degree to which people are dissatisfied with the political system. So on the whole, there are two political cultures. There continue to be two political cultures. In terms of how it translates into electoral politics, the verdict is still out, but there do seem to be growing similarities between East and West, but also persistent differences. Thank you.
Now I turn the floor over to Professor Anderson.
Thank you.
I know you've all been waiting a while, and I'm going to make this very brief. I just thought I would try to point out some interesting themes that connect, interesting to me anyway, themes that connect these papers. We seem to be looking at in a way, it's a search for the domestic counterpart to the international settlement, the post-Cold War settlement that we've been talking about up to this point, certainly last evening and also the first panel today. And what comes across in each of these papers in different ways is the lack of symmetry, that at the international level there was an explicit attempt to bargain, to accommodate interests, to arrive at an understanding of the way forward between the various parties, although it's certainly possible to over-exaggerate the degree to which the East German side dictated things or even had influence at the international level. I mean, obviously the settlement in some ways was really between the United States and the Soviet Union, but there's really no counterpart at the domestic level. I mean, obviously there were negotiations over economic union. There were negotiations over the path to political union of the two Germanys, but this was a very one-sided set of negotiations. There's an interesting story to be told on the European side. It is in some sense a counterpart to the security negotiations. I was trying to think of a term for it. Maybe. Well, if the East Germans had gotten their way, it would have been 2 + 13, and the 13th member is the Commission. But in the end, it was really more like 1 × 1 + 13. The East Germans simply weren't a factor. They tried very desperately to appear at the table with the with their West German counterparts in discussions with the Commission about how to forge a path to accession into the European community, but they were swiftly relegated to the back table. The West Germans wanted no part for them, or no role for them in these discussions. There were a lot of concerns, very similar to what we saw at the international level, expressed by the British, by the French, by others. There was concern that the West Germans would turn East Germany into Hong Kong, a place where no regulation, low wages, etc., would enable this region to compete unfairly with other parts of Europe. And in that sense, they totally misunderstood what the West Germans were about. For the West Germans, if there was no triumphalism on the international side, there was a certain degree of triumphalism at the domestic level. The West Germans were extremely proud of their accomplishments, the social market economy, and thought it was just automatic that it would be transferred lock, stock, and barrel to the East. With major consequences, obviously. And I guess I'll leave you with a thought, which is, if you think about other examples of settlements, of post-war settlements, the collectivist consensus in Britain, the social market economy in Germany, two things come to mind immediately. One is that they took a long time to come into effect. You can really only talk about the establishment of a consensus in Britain about the role of the state and the importance of a rather elaborated welfare state system in 1951, when the Conservatives come to power, having accepted much of what the Labour Party had done in the intervening 6 years. In Germany, it took 10 years. It took really till the Godesberg program was enacted by the Social Democrats to really speak of a two-party consensus about the terms of the social market economy. So these things take time. Now, obviously, we're sitting here at 20 years out from unification, and perhaps to the extent that there is no settlement yet, at least in the minds of East Germans, we've been waiting a long time, or they've been waiting a long time. The other element has to do with the importance of economic performance. I think in each of the cases in Europe, what was critical to the consolidation of a post-war consensus was prosperity, was a high level of economic performance. And to the extent that we have not seen that in Eastern Germany, it's no surprise to me that we still see resentment. We still see the kind of opinion data that Robert described. We see efforts by the courts repeatedly to try to compensate for the losers, as Professor Quint pointed out. And I just leave you with those thoughts. I don't want to put any questions on the table because I'm sure you have plenty of your own. And so we can move to that.
We do have a few minutes for questions, and I welcome them.
I have a question for Peter, actually. When you were talking about the retroactive justice problem, I wonder whether or not, I mean, I have no idea, but there was a tremendous amount of discussion right after 1945 in the British and American zones about precisely this, how to deal with crimes under the Nazi regime that were not actually illegal in the Nazi regime. So I'm wondering whether or not that particular discussion informed the court, both the fact that there were many things left undone, but that now the West Germans had the chance to do something that they felt perhaps they hadn't done correctly.
Yes, I think that's. I think that was a view that was often heard at the time of German unification, that we didn't do it properly in 1949 and so on. So let's do it properly here. There was a philosopher, a legal philosopher, Gustav Radbuch, who wrote some very influential articles in 1945-46, attempting to deal with the retroactivity problem and attempting to justify retroactive punishment in the Nuremberg and thereafter. This is an enormously complicated issue, and because it involves the use of natural law ideas, which were ideas put forth by Radbuch and were used again in the cases after German unification, in which you say, well, it was legal then to do what these people are doing, but that it was so terrible that that has to be disregarded now because there's a higher law that it wasn't written down exactly, but that influences everything. Or there's another way of looking at it to say, well, if we interpret the prior law correctly, which is itself a kind of question-begging term, then it was illegal then also. These are both enormously complicated and in some usages questionable arguments. I think, though, that the way that I would look at it, just to say it very quickly here, is that I think there's got to be an effort to look at the situation in 1945 and the situation in 1989 and say, are they the same? Is what happened in the past the same degree of evil, which would allow the use of these special techniques, according to Rodbrook? And I've actually written a long article on this, which I won't, even if I could remember all the arguments set forth here. But my conclusion is I think that there is a pretty good argument that these are really different situations. Although your question points out that in the ideas both of the CDU from the western side and the Bürgerbewegung from the eastern side, they were comparable.
Thank you. I've got a question about your interpretation of the Linke Party's performance. I would have thought if we take the perspective of somewhere in the 1990s, it would have been a reasonable hypothesis to think, okay, there's a demographic that's going on, basically, to quote the poet, the dead enders are dying off or becoming less important. But we see that it's maintaining itself. And I'd offer, sort of three explanations of what's happening. And I was just wondering what your reaction would be. Number one, you've got young people coming in. Number two, you have basically middle-aged people who, because of this chronic condition, are switching over. And three, simply the strategy of being a Klientelpartei for essentially the people who are getting unemployment compensation, living on transfer payments, that's the clientele that they are approaching. Now, how do you account for this relative strength of the Linke so far down the road?
Mm-hmm. Excellent question. I know what it is not, and it is precisely not. I think it was your number two. It's not simply a clientele party for the old SED functionaries. That's what the initial hunch was, early 1990s, but it has not turned out to be that way. In fact, so what is it then? Well, one is it's connected to the dominance and the salience of social inequality in the minds of Eastern Germans. And by the way, the story I'm telling about Eastern Germany is a story I could tell about all post-communist publics. The data exists, I've looked at it. It's the same story. People in Central Eastern Europe, that includes East Germany, do want to have a democracy. They do want to enjoy civil liberties, but they do want to have a democracy that's quite different from the one that they got. We in the West, that is all of, presumably most of us here, define democracy as liberal democracy, which is primarily defined in procedural terms. You get certain rights, you get the right to vote, but it's a representative democracy. Elites make decisions most of the time. Now, there are other definitions of democracy, legitimate definitions of democracy, one of which is that adds a significant number of substantive rights, material rights, that have to be guaranteed by any political system before procedures become available to citizens. And so Central East Europeans or East Germans continue to adhere to a notion of social egalitarian democracy. It doesn't mean that they want to have the GDR back, hardly anybody does, but it does mean that they want to have a significant component of material security built into the constitutional system. That's the preference that many of them, not all, but many of them adhere to. And my sense is that many voters of the Linke in 2009, as in 2002 and 2005, adhere to that type of model. And given the strong prevalence of this value system, I see a fertile recruitment ground for the Linke Partei for the next several elections. That's why the reservoir does not diminish. It's not simply a generational turnover issue as we saw it in West Germany's post-war history, when the majority of West Germans basically supported the constitution by the end 60s, early 1970s. That's what the data tell us there. It's a different developmental story here. That's the short answer. I have a long one, but not for now.
I'm afraid we have to call our conference to an end. It's been a very long day. I thank all the audience, distinguished audience, who have come here and participated so well and contributed so much. I would like to thank also the Baker Institute once again for hosting this great event, for inspiring it and putting it together, and also their staff. You may not realize how many people are behind the scenes, but you've probably seen people running around with microphones and lunches and other things. And if they're anywhere that can be heard, I'd like to give them a round of applause. And with that, we'll call it a day until the 25th anniversary of German unification or the wall. Thank you.